and welcome everyone to the 2021 Spring Conference. We're going to have a great morning together. Today we'll unveil the 2021 Mereda Index and then host a panel discussion on Maine's real estate economy with the index contributors and Dr. Charlie Colgan. We will also recognize our 2020 Notable Project recipients. We have a great team guiding us through this morning. Shannon Richards of Hay Runner and Craig Young of the Bolos Company are here to act as our hosts and anchors. Now, to say that 2020 was a year like no other is an understatement. And when we zoom in on the Maine real estate market, we see it was a truly remarkable year. I know we've all been watching as the residential market rocketed off the charts, and we felt the impact of the vacant office and retail spaces in our communities. As we saw new construction projects forge ahead with increased demand, this is the story of the 2021 Mereda Index tells, with an excellent report on the economy from Dr. Colgan, commentary on the commercial market from Sherry Bonowitz of Malone Commercial Brokers, insight into the residential market from Joe Dasco of Rieger Dasker Properties, and a perspective on the construction sector from Drew Sigfridson of the Bolos Company. We will begin by hearing from each of them about the 2020 numbers and their feet on the street experience in each sector. We're also looking ahead today. Our index contributors will help us bring that 2020 story forward. After reviewing the 2020 data, Craig and Shannon will lead a forward-looking panel discussion with the whole group. And where do they see the Maine real estate economy heading? And what are the opportunities and the challenges that lay ahead for all of us as we rebuild our economy? It's a timely and important conversation, and I'm grateful to be having it with our Mereda members across the state. Please share your thoughts with us on Twitter and Facebook. Recreate those conversations and the connections that you're having in person, but online. We are at Mereda 2 and hashtag Mereda 2021. Now let's get into it. Here is Matt Worthen of Eaton Peabody, our index underwriter, to introduce the 2021 Mereda Index. Welcome, Matt.
Josh, thank you. Eaton Peabody is thrilled to underwrite this edition of the Mereda Index, the industry's leading measure of the pulse of Maine's real estate market. It's an important economic indicator for Mereda members, their thousands of employees, and Maine's economy at large. At Eaton Peabody, we think this is one of the best baseline measures for the health of the Maine real estate market. Incredibly, this edition of the Mereda Index comes in at 113.3, which is a 2.8% increase over the annual average of 2019. This includes the economy's sharp drop during the first half of 2020 because of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the upward swing in the second half of the year. Eaton Peabody is now pleased to welcome Dr. Charles Colgan, Professor Emeritus of Public Policy and Planning in the Muskie School of Public Service, to tell us more about the numbers. Dr. Colgan served 12 years in the Maine State Planning Office, including positions as Maine State Economist and Director of the Maine Coastal Program. He currently serves as Director of Research at the Center for the Blue Economy at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey in Monterey, California. We are fortunate that he shares his expertise with the Mereda members and develops the index for us each year. To kick off our morning session, Dr. Colgan will briefly review the 2020 data from each of the three major components of the index. We will then hear commentary from our index contributors about their experience during 2020. Charlie, welcome to the Mereda Spring Conference.
Thanks, Matt. The Mereda Index is a measure of the overall real estate market in Maine. It comprises three separate indexes, one dealing with the commercial sector, one dealing with the residential sector, and one dealing with construction, which affects both sectors. The index is based on the beginning of 2006, and so it tracks the real estate market through the last recession, into the expansion, and it will track it into the future on the basis of the measures to see what's happening with the COVID-19 recession. The 113.3 means the index is now 13% above where we were in 2006 overall. The 2.8% growth indicates that the real estate sector did pretty well in a period in which, for the most part, the economy as a whole was contracting and contracting severely. The rest of our story will be why that has been the case.
I'm curious, what can you tell us about residential real estate in Maine for 2020, other than it was the hottest year in recent history?
The residential index tells what was literally the headline story about real estate in 2020. And I mean headline because there was a story almost every month about the nature of the real estate market, about the record levels of sales. And it was a very dramatic story in the midst of what was for the economy a very dramatic year. But it was one of the few bright spots in the whole year. You can see that in the tracking of the real estate residential index, that the index tracked up very rapidly towards the end of the year in the third and fourth quarters after a bad start because of the pandemic. And at 118.30, the index for the residential component sits at its highest level, almost 20% above pre-Great Recession and substantially above even the last few years of activity. The real estate residential index comprises 4 components. The first is residential permits. The second is mortgage originations for new purchases. It excludes second mortgages. The median price of homes from the Maine Association of Realtors, along with the sales of existing units. Those last two are released by the Maine Realtors every month, and we track them monthly and combine them into quarterly and seasonally adjust them so that we don't get the big ups and downs from the season. The story in the residential market is primarily a large kick up in existing unit sales. That index at the end of 2020 stood at 157.76, almost 60% above levels from the mid-2000s. The median price has hit record levels, about 40% above 2000s, and it has continued to climb, but it's not quite as volatile as the existing units part of the index. The interesting story on the other 2 components of the index are that residential permits climbed and then dipped a little bit at the end of the year. And it will be an interesting forecast for what happens in construction in the residential sector in 2021. The one interesting thing about the mortgage originations portion of the index is that it actually fell, even as existing units were significantly increasing. And that raises some interesting questions that the index doesn't really answer. It suggests, however, that there was a lot of purchase activity that was financed by equity rather than by debt. That will probably still have to be confirmed as more and more detailed data becomes available, but it was a very interesting phenomenon to see the existing units grow so fast while mortgage originations drop. Those things have tended to move together. You can look here at the last 3 years from 2018 first quarter to the 2020 the fourth quarter. You can see that huge increase in the third quarter. There's a little bit of a bump in the residential index in the second quarter, but the things really take off in the third quarter and then level out a little bit in the fourth quarter. The 4 components, though, on the left side is residential permits, mortgage originations, the median price, and existing units. And you can see that the existing units fell during the second quarter as the world shut down in COVID world, but then rebounded spectacularly in the third quarter and did fairly well. The only reason the index didn't do as well, frankly, in the fourth quarter was because of that dip in mortgage originations. Everything else was pretty well up, as was residential permits. That is the picture just for 2020, and you can see that the indicators are pointing in slightly different directions. I think that the debt equity issue with respect to the financing of residential properties and the question of construction of the residential sector in 2021, presaged by the residential permits, is an interesting question. It will be a significant portion of the 2021 industry will be affected by what's happening in the first quarter with respect to residential permits and building plans for the first quarter. So the residential index shows a substantial positive news in terms of the sales of existing units and median prices. The mortgage originations and permits point to some interesting questions about how the residential market will develop, but the pandemic has brought a whole bunch of questions about how the residential and commercial real estate markets will evolve in the future that suggest a fairly complex set of factors affecting it.
Thank you, Dr. Colgan. Good morning, everyone. I'm Craig Young, and I'm here with my wonderful co-host, Shannon Richards.
Hi, Craig, thanks. Joe Dasco from Rieger Dasco is here today with us. Joe is going to talk to us about the residential market in 2020. Welcome, Joe. Thank you for being here. Can you give us the highlights for 2020 from your company's perspective?
Well, for highlights, we've been working on a large project, Hobson's Landing, which is an 85-unit residential development in downtown Portland. We've been working on this project, really got off the ground with a master plan starting in 2017, and we're just wrapping up the second phase, which is the residential portion of the project. So highlight for 2020 was getting through the construction of this project during a pandemic, which has been a challenge to say the least, but we're there and just about wrapping up the final details, and residents are moving in. So it's has a happy ending to what we thought would be a very difficult year.
Well, that's great. Yeah, it's a beautiful building. Thank you. We were talking a little bit about the residential sales in 2020. Would you say that they were strong the whole year? We heard from Dr. Colgan that they were down in the beginning, first two quarters, and then they went up.
So what we experienced, I think, was probably much of what everybody experienced, reflects what Dr. Colgan had touched on, which is in the beginning of the year up to early March, our sales were steady. I'll call them pre-sales because our building wasn't completed at that point. And then the world shut down pretty much from March until early June, where we didn't have any showings. We didn't even know how to show a unit, waiting for CDC guidelines if people could even come to our site. Luckily, we were able to continue construction during that period. And then slowly, people started to feel comfortable of getting out, and showings started happening again in June, and June and July picked right up where we left off in February, and I think it's reflected in Dr. Colgan's index, where sales ended up at the end of 2020, which was at a strong point.
As Dr. Colgan said, the residential sector was driving the index. He also mentioned that more properties were financed by equity than debt. I know you folks have sold a number of your units at Hobson's Landing, 70 or more. What is your experience with out-of-state buyers and people using equity over debt?
So there's a lot into that question. Let me start off with away versus local. I'm going to say about 30% of our buyers, 35% are probably out of state. However, they have some ties to Maine. Either they grew up here, left to have a career, and have since returned home to be closer to family and want to get back to what they love about Maine. And then you also have a percentage of those buyers who are out of state that are actually moving here and calling Maine their new home. The rest of the 70% buyers are either made up of local buyers who are either moving from the suburbs, maybe empty nesters, and want to get into the urban lifestyle, be close to, have that walkable, safe city, close to restaurants, shops, museums. And then we're also seeing a strong uptick in professionals who now, with Zoom and video technology, can work from anywhere, and they're choosing affordable and great city to live in, such as Portland, to do that. As to the second part of your question, equity versus debt, we do see, we call them cash buyers in the marketplace. The vast majority are still financed. Whether a buyer is in a position to pay cash, they're still taking advantage of the very attractive rates today. But there is a period where people do come in and say that financing is not an issue, and they waive that contingency in the contract.
Yeah, we're seeing that throughout. Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you for bringing this great building to Commercial Street.
Thank you.
And Craig, thank you.
Thank you, Joe. And up next, Dr. Colgan will speak to us about the commercial sector.
Thanks, Craig. That was a very helpful discussion on the residential sector. We now turn to the commercial sector, where we ask the question, can a world in which no one goes to the office and no one goes to stores still be a place in which commercial real estate is sold? The answer to the question is yes, it can. The commercial index, which is comprised, like the residential index, of 4 components, showed not nearly the spectacular growth that you saw in the residential index because of existing units, but it was actually pretty steady in 2020 over 2019. Now, it's important to understand first that the commercial index is a very volatile sector. It's driven by the number of transactions, the square foot of transactions, both lease and sale, and by the sales price and lease rate per square foot. And it's a very volatile sector in small economies like Maine. Although we do track as much as possible every commercial transaction in the state, it's still driven largely by the Portland market. And a few large buildings can have a lot of an effect on the index itself. A decline in the indexes you see from 2019 is not necessarily a bad thing. It's simply a measure of the volatility in the sector. What's interesting about the commercial sector is that it's now, like the residential sector, above 2006 levels. It has not been until the last couple of years. So it has definitely showed some strength. And the commercial sector in COVID world has done not too badly for a number of reasons, some of which are, frankly, that a lot of the construction, a lot of the development, a lot of the transactions were in process long before the coronavirus hit. As I said, there are 4 sectors, 4 measures. Commercial transactions, both real estate, both sales and leasing transactions. The square footage, price per square foot on sales, and the lease rate per square footage. And I should thank Bolus and Company. I always try to do that because they provide me with the data from which I can construct the commercial index. In general, the best performing part of the sector, commercial sector, was on the sales side. The sales price per square foot did go up, even as the leased rate was going down somewhat. That's in fact probably what you would expect from an economic situation like the pandemic. Long-term transactions committed to ahead of time were in fact kept going. Shorter-term transactions like leasing fell off. The number of transactions that took place dropped sharply, like real estate, like residential, in the first half of the year, and recovered in the second half of the year, though only to about the same level that had existed at the end of 2019. If you look at the last 3 years here, this is the percent change in the index over the last 3 years. And one of the things that stands out is that huge jump in the second quarter of 2019. And that's an example of the volatility I mentioned. That was a couple of large square foot transactions that drove the index to a very high level. But you'll see that it sunk right back down again into the more, sort of more normal change range. And if you look at the components individually with 2020 in the boxes, you see that for transactions, the first 3 quarters were pretty good. They tailed off a little bit, and I think that was mostly leasing transactions. Square footage was down in terms of the total volume of square footage, not surprising at all. The sales price was up in the first part of the year and sort of flat in the second part. And the lease rate declined fairly sharply in the first part of the year before recovering in the second half. I think, again, I want to emphasize that small numbers of transactions here drive big changes in the index. So it's a little, you have to take this one a little more carefully in terms of percent changes than you do with the residential index. But the answer to the question, can you continue to have a vibrant commercial real estate market in a world in which nobody comes to the office and nobody goes to stores, appears to be yes, you can.
Thank you, Dr. Colgan. And next we have Sherry Bonowitz from Malone Commercial Brokers to speak to the commercial sector. Interestingly, the indicators are showing us, according to Dr. Colgan, that the sales price per square foot is up. Can you talk to us about your experience this year and what you have going on in the commercial world?
Absolutely. Thank you, Shannon. As Dr. Colgan said, the price per square foot for sales has increased. I think that's due to kind of the stall that was in the first 6 months of last year, after February. We found that, a lot of people were already involved in transactions. It just paused them, and then once June, July, August, we started back at, with those transactions moving forward. I think we saw large leases such as Barry Dunn, which during the pandemic was a huge lease of 88,000 square feet. And also Jordan's Furniture at the main mall. That was 100,000 square feet. Such, sectors like that, any home improvements really did well last year.
And while the office market and the retail market certainly suffered a bit over the past year for sure, the industrial market is on fire. Tell us a little bit why you think the industrial market continues to just grow and prosper.
Yep, the industrial market, I feel, really expanded because of warehouse and distribution use. A lot of people were looking for storage. Also, the cannabis industry took a lot of that, as that's really growing, so to speak, in this market. And also, Abbott Labs took 200,000 square feet with their work with the COVID labs and testing.
So could you talk to us about where you see the intersection of all retail, commercial, anything else that tying together what Dr. Colgan was talking about in his review of the index?
Yes, the office space, I think a lot of people didn't know what was going to happen, as all of us didn't know what was going to happen last March. And I think a lot of people renewed their lease for a year, even though their employees were not coming into the office. We're seeing that start to change a bit. I think employers really want their employees in the office. Employees really want to be back with people. With the vaccination, I think that's starting to change.
And I think we're also seeing some office spaces looking to expand because we need more social distancing at the office so we can be with each other, but we can be apart. Are you seeing any?
Yes, I'm working with a few large office tenant companies that have always had the open space, and now they're looking for the individual offices again.
So changes in the office
Yeah.
space. That could be a good breakfast, Craig.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we head into 2021, what other changes do you see coming down the pike?
With retail, that was a little stagnant, and unfortunately some of the businesses went out of business. But in the Old Port especially, we're seeing a ton of leasing in retail with new restaurants coming into play. So hopefully they'll be up and running by the summer, and hopefully vacation land will seem like vacation land.
Yeah, that's one of the greatest things about Mereda is that we see a lot of the people who show up here are really very favorable about the real estate market in Maine, and we're here to talk about that. So thank you so much for joining us today. Craig?
Thank you, Sherry. And now let's head back to Dr. Colgan, where he'll discuss the construction index.
Thanks, Craig. Last, we'll look at the construction index. The construction index is in some ways the simplest of them all. It tracks one indicator, which is construction employment. But the construction indicators index is actually a kind of complex measure because it bridges the past with the future. It is representative of the past because it represents plans and investments, decisions that were made long before the construction employment got started on a building. And it represents the future because it describes the amount of capacity, the amount of physical space that will be available in the future for people to work in, shop in, and produce goods and services in. The construction index has been pretty consistently growing since the depths of the Great Recession, which were in the latter part of 2009, early 2010. There was a small hiccup in 2018, and then in the first part of 2020, there was a decline, which has been described in the other indexes as well, as we all settled into COVID world. And then with the turn of the third quarter, began to figure out ways to accommodate ourselves to the pandemic. And so the construction index overall showed a slight decline, a very, very slight decline. It's basically a statistically insignificant decline over the year. As you can see here, the change in the construction index by quarter from 2018 to the end of 24. You can see that 2019 was actually a pretty boring year. It was up slightly some quarters, down slightly other quarters. 2018 was very volatile, way down in the first quarter, way up in the second quarter. 2020, we see a big drop in the second quarter. As I said, we're trying to figure out what's going on in COVID world, but then solid growth in the second part of the year, so that on balance, the construction employment was down slightly for the year. But the really important point here is that construction employment is basically back to where it was 15 years ago. It's been the longest component of the index coming back to pre-Great Recession levels, but it's almost there. If it had not been for the pandemic, it's almost certainly the case that 2020 would have been the year in which the construction employment fully recovered to pre-Great Recession levels. Now, the construction story is also a very good metaphor for how real estate differed from the rest of the economy. So in this graph, what we're showing on the blue line is the index, essentially, and then the red line represents the red columns represent the changes quarter to quarter. And what you can see here is the collapse of the construction industry in the Great Recession. There was a mini recession in construction in 2013, and you can see a small change in the months early part of 2020, followed by a resumption of growth. Compare this graph of construction with what happened in the rest of the Maine economy, and you can see that the rest of the Maine economy was far more severely affected by the pandemic than the Great Recession. As a whole, the Great Recession took, in fact, even a much smaller portion of our employment away than did the first part of the pandemic in early 2020. And this is one of those things that sets real estate aside, is that people were able to get back to work and were able to continue production of new buildings, new commercial and residential buildings. it's also something of a question about the future, because as I said, construction employment is largely the result of decisions that were made a year, 2 or 3 years in the past. And so what does the pandemic mean for construction in 2021, and even more so in 22 through 2025 or so, and the rest of the decade? That's very unclear. It's very much a question of how much more office space and real estate space we'll need. Does the real estate space that was vacated by the bankruptcies in the pandemic, will that accommodate growth in real estate for retail sector into the next few years? Do we need more office space, or will social distancing reduce the demand for it? And there's a whole debate that's going on nationally, and just today a report from the University of Chicago saying that up to 1/3 of workers would take a pay cut to stay working at home. So the whole future of the real estate sector and the construction in the real estate sector has not been made clear yet. While 2020 showed a fairly robust set of trends, the future with respect to all of the elements in real estate is very much open to some large changes, which we just aren't sure whether they're going to occur or not. It will make tracking the Mereda Index in the future perhaps even more interesting.
Thank you, Dr. Colgan. Next, we have Drew Sigfridson from the Bolus Company to talk about the construction part of the index. Drew, I understand you are deeply involved with the Scarborough Downs construction. Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. So in Scarborough Downs, now called the Downs, the construction has been going at an unprecedented pace. It's on the commercial side along Payne Road, and then also on the residential side on Route 1. The first phase was about 135 units, all of which were sold out. These were apartments, condos, single-family homes. There's a memory care facility. Currently, there's 40 affordable senior housing units being built. All of those are anticipated to fill very, very quickly. On the commercial side, the construction has been going at a very fast pace. They went in and built all of the infrastructure for the roads, for stormwater, water, sewer, fiber, power, and it became turnkey lots, essentially, pad-ready lots. And so owner users were able to come, put a lot under contract, go and get site plan approval, and immediately start construction. So there are over 20 buildings slated to be built there over the course of 2021, and more anticipated in the near future. So it's brisk.
Andrew, I understand you sit on the board at Chinbro. Can you talk a little bit about construction on a statewide level, how Chinbro has done?
Well, I might just back up for a second. Charlie's index indicated that, some of these construction insights were that 2020 saw a very strong economy as it pertains to the construction industry and to the real estate industry. There was that blip in the second quarter, but then it really continued to pick up. Mm-hmm. And, at Chinbro, we saw a very similar trend, and it ended up being a strong year. From now going forward into 2021, there are some uncertainties out there. A big one is construction costs associated with labor and materials. Mm-hmm. Materials are impossible to predict right now. What the costs of steel and wood, concrete, asphalt, what are these construction costs going to be now and in the near future? On some projects, we were seeing steel increases within 3 months, 30%. And you can't predict a development budget when you have this unpredictability in construction materials, which are such a huge component of development deals.
Absolutely. That's what we're finding too when we look at the predictors. Is it possible that the permits submitted within municipalities in Maine are an indicator of the amount of construction coming down the pike, and we're seeing, no, that's false, that is not a good indicator?
Yeah, that's interesting that, sometimes permits and construction, aren't completely aligned. One thing that we're starting to see now, because there is so much growth, there is so much activity level, especially in southern Maine, we're starting to see some municipalities put restrictions on growth. You're seeing that in the number of permits that they will allow for residential construction, and then also in some cases for commercial construction. So that's something to be aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. I think everybody watching this and involved with this presentation is well aware of the risks involved in development.
And the market can be volatile. What are some of the predictors you see as being problematic with construction costs being so high going into the future? What are some of the downsides we may see with that?
You know, right now we're seeing a very strong market, so lease rates and purchase prices, let's say for multifamily residential or for residential condos, are very strong. Demand is very strong. Interest rates are low. So you have a few of the key elements that should be a good sign for a construction industry. The problem is the volatility in construction materials and labor. So that piece of it is a real risk for the development projects going forward. And we're hoping that this severe escalation in material costs will level out and start to come down over the course of the next 12 to 18 months, but we're not sure.